not about being the strong one or being the disrespectful one or, being the detached, aloof one. It's about keeping yourself emotionally safe.
Welcome back to Happiness in Progress. I'm your host, Danielle Craig. I'm an Emmy Award-winning journalist, a mom, wife, and you know what I like to say, just a person looking for more joy in the everyday. This podcast is brought to you by the Mail Tribune. You can find more podcasts at mailtribune.com. If you like listening, don't forget to subscribe. And it really helps me out when you give the podcast a rating in Apple Podcasts. You can just go stroll all the way down to the podcast page and click on 5 stars. Okay, guys, it is election week. I know it is a stressful week, and that is why I wanted to have the boundaries therapist on. Cassandra Rowe is a licensed professional counselor and LPC clinical supervisor. She has worked as a student support counselor, a crisis counselor, and she is the owner of Epiphany Counseling Services, LLC. I wanted to have her on the podcast because I know in this month of November, we need to set boundaries, whether that be for political conversations or whether that be high stress and emotional conversations at Thanksgiving dinner. I wanted to give you the tools to do that. I wanted to give you the tools on how to get out of there. So we talk about how to set boundaries, why it's important to do this, how we don't have to be responsible for anything other than ourselves, even some really great deflecting practices on how to get out of some of those conversations, and how to give ourselves time to process whatever the election results are. I'm recording this before the election, so let's get to it. I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Cassandra. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
The first thing I want to ask you, because we're in this month now, that's probably one of the scariest of 2020 because we've got this double whammy. We have an emotionally charged election, plus right after that, a holiday in which we all get together with our family and friends. As the boundaries therapist, what are some of the first thoughts you have about that?
Scary, very scary. This election has really taught us so much. Never in the history of the DSM has there ever been a actual formal disorder related to elections. And so there recently came out a disorder called election stress disorder. And so it tells us that many people are struggling with the stress and the anxiety related to the election.
Mm-hmm. How do you think that is going to play a role in having conversations in a day? We're going to get some results and we're going to know possibly the outcome of the election. How is that going to impact our well-being when then we're going to be with family who we may not agree with, or we're going to have relationships with friends who we may not agree with?
Right. Well, one of the things that I have encouraged my clients through all of 2020, which has been just the most unsettling year ever, is that no matter what happens, we're going to be okay. And so that is one of the things that I encourage my clients to just really meditate on. We have had, unsettling things that have happened before. I remember after 9/11 and everyone was so stressed and our safety really was at stake. At the end of the day, we're going to be okay regardless of how the election turns out. The other thing is that I think one of the things that is really unsettling for me as a therapist is that this election has had such poor boundaries. I mean, when we look at the debates with the emotional abuse on both sides, when we look at just the things that are in the media, never have candidates' children been used in an election. And so as someone who understands the importance of boundaries, it's very important that even though people around you are not practicing healthy boundaries, that we still have the right and the ability to practice those.
So if someone's listening and thinking, well, it is true that I'm having a really hard time having conversations with this person and this person and this person, soon I'm going to be in a room with them. What is your advice to start to first set the boundaries yourself? How do we determine what I'm okay with talking about? What kind of conversations I'm okay with having? Where do we start with this?
Right. So the first thing is to know that, boundaries keep us safe. They keep us physically safe and they keep us emotionally safe. So if there's anything that makes you feel unsafe, it's okay not to engage in that. And so I have a rule that I don't talk politics with people I really am not in a relationship with. And
Mm,
that's just my rule. And so what that means is that I don't talk politics at work. I don't talk politics on social media. That's just one of my rules because I know that one of my boundaries is that I don't tolerate, emotional abuse. I don't tolerate intellectual boundary violations, and that means, when people are putting you down for if your belief is different from theirs.
hmm
And so that's one of the ways that I set that boundary. That's just something that I don't engage in. Um, the other thing is that we really have to protect our space. And so it is very important for us to limit and structure how much media we're taking in. And so I can be the worst. I love CNN. I have CNN on all the time. A lot of times it's just background
hmm
noise,
hmm
but it's very important for me to structure and pace myself during this election and even with COVID, because there's so much that we're taking in. We're taking it in on social media, we're taking it in on news outlets. So it's important for us to really limit the amount of media that we take in. That's a great way to set a boundary.
I think that is exactly that, boundaries. With sometimes I think we think of boundaries only as with people, but the media that we consume I think is important as well. Thanks for bringing that up. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were saying the emotional abuse, and you said another type of abuse where people are putting
Intellectual abuse
intellectual
or
abuse.
intellectual boundaries that are violated.
When people are first setting their boundaries, how can they start to realize, oh, this is what happens to me when I'm talking to this person? How do we make that realization?
So that's kind of a trigger. So I tell my clients, if you feel some kind of way about an interaction that you
Uh-huh.
had with someone, that there's probably a boundary that was violated, and that's worth exploring. So, your boundaries people don't have to understand your boundaries, but they
Mm.
do have to respect them. And so if you are feeling any sort of distress in an interaction with someone, then that's probably an indication that a boundary is needed.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
You mentioned your boundaries, were both boundaries that you had kinda total control of. You have control of, "Okay, I'm not gonna talk to," well, actually, you have control over not posting, but if someone's coming at you in the office with their political speech, how do you respond when you know personally you have set this boundary? What does that exchange look like?
So one of the things that's important about boundaries is that we first of all, we have to identify them, and
Mhm.
then we have to verbalize them, and then we
Mm.
have to enforce them. So I think a lot of times we get the whole identifying them. I know what my boundaries are. Sometimes it's difficult to verbalize them, but it's the enforcement part that many of us struggle with,
Mm.
myself included.
That
And
could be
so
an
with
awkward
that,
conversation.
it is. It usually, when we're talking about boundaries, it's usually awkward.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, when somebody violates your boundary, they've offended you.
Mhm,
I mean, and who wants to have conversations with people about how they offended me? I mean, that
mhm.
can be very uncomfortable. So, what that looks like for me is that's just not something that I, talk about. That's just not something that I feel comfortable talking about here. I don't think it's an appropriate place for us to talk about it. It just looks just like that.
Mm.
No is a boundary within itself, no period. And so we don't have to explain our no's. We don't have to justify or rationalize our no. It's just a no.
I love that. A no can be a full sentence. I think that it's really easy to set the boundaries and then not explain them. And in my case, that just creates resentment. I'll just be like, you're not sticking to the boundaries I set that you have no idea exist. Talk me through why it's so important to start communicating, maybe even especially before we know we're walking into like a Thanksgiving dinner where there are certain family members that we're not going to agree with and we know certain things come up. How do we talk about it so we're not leaving that dinner super resentful?
Right. I think first, before talking about it, it's important for you to have a plan, a boundaries plan.
Mm.
So, for example, my boundaries plan may be a buzzword with my husband. Usually it's with my sister in our family. And so she and I usually develop a plan before. And so if this, or this happens, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And then you know what that means. And so it's important for you to go into those situations with a plan. For you to identify, if it's politics, I'm not going to talk about politics. Family gathering should be a time for us to just be and not do. And so whether it is politics, family trauma, conflicts, holidays are really not the time for us to try to, solve those kind of issues. And so I go into family gatherings with a list of things that I already know I'm not going to talk about. If they happen to come up, I have a plan. It's usually called an escape plan, but I have a plan for how I'm going to avoid those things. And so I am usually, when my large family is around, I'm usually the person that does all the store runs. If you're constantly going back and forth to the store, you can't really engage fully in those kind of conversations. So that's a good way for me to kind of avoid those things. Another thing, there's never enough help with the kids who are in the family. And so if you are spending your time, with the kids when those kind of conversations come up, then you don't really get pulled into that. And so having a plan, being able to shut down certain situations if they come up and they offend you. Really, at a family gathering, that's really not the time for us to, have these conversations about being offended. And so you either get out or you distract. And so at a later time, it's probably more appropriate to talk about whatever the offense was. Also, if you know that, I know that I have certain family members that I have a time boundary with, because I know after a certain doses, girl, doses. So after a certain amount of time, I know that they are probably going to get under my skin. And so we set a time boundary before we go. We're only staying 2 hours. In some cases, is I'm leaving before the drinking starts. We know that drinking and boundaries do not go together. And so, whatever that time limit is, that's a time boundary, and you have a right to set that boundary.
I love that there's so much personal responsibility with this as well. So when you're there at dinner and something's coming up and people are engaging you in something you're not wanting to talk about, the best thing, because it's a family gathering, is to just kind of exit. You don't really need to have a conversation of, I don't want to talk about this, or is there anything you can say like, I don't want to talk about this, or you just kind of back up slowly?
Right. Like, change the subject. I mean, there's nothing, I think that the art of changing the subject is so underrated. So deflect, change the subject, excuse yourself, be busy, do something in the kitchen, do something outside. Humor is a great way, deflect with humor. So again, we don't really, a family gathering is not the time to solve world peace. It just really isn't, or all the problems that we've had in our family since way before we were born, the generational problems. That's really not, Thanksgiving dinner is not an appropriate place. And so it is okay to use whatever coping strategies you need to use to keep yourself safe. So it's not about being the strong one or being the disrespectful one or, being the detached, aloof one. It's about keeping yourself emotionally safe.
You know what? My personality that I take on is, I got to solve this for everyone. This is my boundary. Now I'm going to make it everyone's boundary. We're not going to talk about this, everyone. So I might even walk into a conversation to try to end it. What would you, that's probably not the right thing today. What would you say to me?
What I would say about that is to remember that one of the rules of boundaries is that it teaches us what we are and we aren't responsible for. And so when I tell you that rule, when I learned that rule, it was so freeing. Some stuff I don't even have to address because I'm not responsible for it. And so that is what helps me kind of steer clear, even when I want to engage. Healthy boundaries teach us what we are and we aren't responsible for. So that frees us from feeling guilty. That frees us from being guilted or persuaded or coerced into things. I'm just not responsible for that. So I don't have to address it.
I love that. I also love that you said that family gatherings are a time to be, not do. That is so good. What do you think? What are some steps, especially if you have a doing family, a problem-solving family? What are some steps to start to be and not do within that family gathering?
I think it's important. Again, many of us go astray because we don't have a plan. And it's the same thing with my family. We're going to get together for Thanksgiving. Everybody's going to come over. We're going to watch the game. And then we're going to have a lot of idle time. And when you have that idle time, then all of these things come up. So I think it's important to have some idle time just for us to be, but also to have some structured idle time. Let's play a game. Let's have an activity. Let's, make sure that we're making the most of our time together. Let's take pictures. Let's, go around the table and talk about what we're thankful for this year. Let's go around the table and talk about what has changed from last year to this year. And so having some structured kind of activities that help us bond really keeps down on some of that, the unwanted conversations. I know at my family, if we're all just sitting around watching TV, something is bound to come up because, TV is so triggering. So either the news is going to come on or somebody's going to say something that's going to trigger somebody. So, yeah.
One of the other things you said was having a plan with someone. I love that idea that there also is power in numbers. So if there's maybe a like-minded family member, you call them up, or your partner, you call them up and you make a plan together. How does that help?
It helps because, you're not in it alone. Sometimes if you are the healthiest person in the group, sometimes you feel very isolated. And so it's important for you also to have support while you're trying to set your boundary. And so even if that person doesn't understand it, if they are on board, you guys are on the same page, then they can be a support system and kind of run interference when you're trying to set that boundary. So it does help you not to feel so alone.
Yeah, I love that. I want to go back to politics. We're recording this on Monday, Election Tuesday. This is going to run on Thursday. So this is going to be an emotionally charged week. We know this going in. At least half of the country is going to be disappointed. Either I'm going to be disappointed or this particular family member I have is going to be disappointed, or this particular group of people I see regularly is going to be disappointed. What can I do to start putting the boundaries in place so that I am not emotionally burnt out by the end of this month?
Yeah. So like I said before, it's okay not to watch the election results. I saw on CNN that they're starting like their election coverage at like 4:00. I'm like, so it is okay not to watch the election coverage. A lot of times we have that FOMO, fear of missing out. You're going to know the results of the election. It's going to be all over the place. And so we know that they may not even have the final totals at night. And so it's okay not to watch. Again, having that plan, I think it's very important because we know this is going to be such an emotionally charged election, to have a plan for some self-care. As a boundaries therapist, I believe self-care is the greatest boundary of them all. And so, instead of watching the election, I know for me, a group of therapists and we're having an election watch party, but we're not going to watch the election. We're just going to support each other, talk about strategies that we can implement to help ourselves and our clients in the coming weeks. We're just going to talk about happy stuff. So having a plan of self-care on how you're going to deal with this additional stress, instead of watching the election, maybe watch a movie or, cook your favorite dinner or, take a walk, go out, get outside, anything that helps you to feel good. And then the other thing is that I believe that the best thing we can do for our mental health is to spend time with people who are good for our mental health. A lot of times we spend time with people who are not good for our mental health, whether that be at work or sometimes it's our family. And so I think it's very important to identify those people that make you feel good. For me, it's my granddaughter. So spending time with her, very good
She's
for
so
my mental
cute.
health. Oh my gosh, she's such a hoot. She'll be 2 in December. She is the joy of my life. So yeah, so spend time with people who are good for your mental health. Again, just because someone is trying to engage with you doesn't mean that you have to engage. If someone is calling me on the telephone and I know that this is going to be a very emotionally charged conversation, I don't have to answer. I can let it go to voicemail. If someone is texting me and I know that right now I'm not in a good place and that this is not good for my mental health, I don't have to respond, or I can respond, hey, those automatic text response, sorry, I can't talk right now.
Yeah.
You can do that. That's a boundary.
That's empowering. I think
Yes,
especially
very
throughout this
empowering.
week. For those people that are not good for your mental health, if you're dealing with those people, maybe they're people who sit next to you at work and you see these people over and over again. How do you navigate that when you can't necessarily not be at work? You got to be sitting next to this person. Are there any tips that someone could take to work with them and protect their mental health while sitting next to someone who's not good for it?
Right. So I know a lot of people who are taking off the day after the election. And I think that's great. If you have the time to do that, I think that's a great way to practice boundaries and self-care. Putting headphones in. If you don't want, if your employer allows it and you don't want to hear all of, because sometimes it's not directed directly at you. Sometimes you're just hearing the chatter. Put your headphones in. One of the places that we know tends to be very highly charged is the lunchroom. So when you have large employers, those kind of conversations go on in the lunchroom. Don't eat in the lunchroom. If you know this week that all those conversations are going to be going on in the break room, avoid the break room. Okay. If you have your own office, close your door so that you don't have to hear those things. I understand that setting boundaries a lot of times feels different, but it should feel different because you're protecting yourself. And so there's nothing wrong with, being very gentle with yourself in the next coming weeks and avoiding some of those things that trigger you.
If you find yourself in a conversation where it's a one-on-one conversation and it's politics and you disagree, but you don't want to debate because it doesn't feel good. You can tell it's a circle kind of thing. What do you do? How do you exit that?
Hey, I forgot I have a meeting in about 5 minutes
Deflect.
that I have to prepare for. Deflect.
Okay.
No, really, deflect. One of the things going back to the boundary rule that boundaries teach us what we're responsible for. I'm not responsible for explaining myself to you. I'm not responsible for making you understand that. And so if you need to excuse yourself, do that. Do that.
And
because the longer that you engage, the more you're going to get drawn in and the harder it's going to be for you to set a boundary.
I love that idea because I also think it can be respectful. Sometimes when we're trying to get in the conversation, it can be just disrespectful.
Yes.
But just
I know for me,
exit the conversation.
Yeah, I know for me, I very much try to avoid situations where I know that I'm not going to be my best.
Mm,
And so if I know that this situation is triggering for me and I am not sure how I'm going to respond, I try to avoid that until a later time when I know that and I'm prepared to respond in an appropriate way. Because
mhm.
at the end of the day, even if you're triggered by something, you're still responsible for your behavior. And so that's one of the things that I try to keep in mind. If I don't think I can be responsible for my behavior, then I try to avoid that situation until I'm in a better place and I can.
Mhm. You mentioned that you and several other therapists are going to be talking election night about different strategies. What are some strategies that you at least have on the top of your head that could help the listeners in the coming days, post election, just dealing with the ways that they're feeling?
Mhm. So one of the I think one of the most important things is to give yourself time to process.
Mm,
This is not, regardless of the outcome, we're going to be processing this for a while. And so it's okay for you to take as long as you need to process. And what we know about processing things is sometimes we don't have the words to just to identify what we're feeling,
mm,
and that's totally normal. The other thing is that there are gonna be some losses. We've already lost so much, and anytime that you have a loss, grief is accompanied by loss. And so I think it's important to give yourself time to grieve. Um, I kind of feel like after this election, we've all kind of been holding our breath and it's going to be a great big exhale. And so I'm so looking forward to the exhale.
mhm.
Um, the other thing is, I have a massage scheduled for this weekend because I know.
Practical. Mhm.
Yes, very practical. So because I know that that's one of my kind of monthly self-care strategies that I use. And so I will be having a massage. I am taking off of work. I'm one of those people that is taking off of work the day of the election.
Mhm.
So, and depending on how I have processed up so far, I may take off Wednesday too,
Mm,
because I've got to make sure that I am in a place where I can help my clients.
mhm.
And so those are some of the things that I'm doing. Spending time with people that are good for my mental health, good food always. And so I'm sure I'll have some good snacks because it's a virtual kind of meeting. Having a plan for afterwards, taking time to process. Those are the things that are on the list for me.
You know what? When you talk about processing and taking that time and that space for ourselves, we live in a 21st century world and we do not process a thing, do we? We're,
Don't.
we're going to get the election results and we're going to get on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all the things and write our thoughts without giving ourselves that time. That's a revelation to me. So, how what would you advise people, that moment, that pause between the response and getting the information, how to
Give it
process?
24 hours.
Mm,
Well, first and foremost, you don't have to respond to anything.
at
And I
all.
think that in this social media, um, you know, era that we live in, I think that social media causes us so much anxiety. If somebody writes something, we feel like, oh, I have to respond. And so not responding is part of your self-care, because what happens is when you respond, then they respond, and then we're back and forth. So understanding that I'm not responsible for responding to anything that I don't want to respond to. The second thing is, like I said, we're going to experience some grief with this election cycle, regardless. And so we know that grief takes a lot of time to process. We're talking about grief of the death of someone. We know that that takes at least 2 years to process fully. And so it's important to understand that we're still going to be processing this in December. and in January and probably next summer. And so understanding that going in, and setting that as a goal, like, hey, I know that I'm not going to be completely processed. I have not completely processed this by the end of the year, and that there may be some things that are continued to trigger me through 2021, and understanding that up front and just kind of be preparing for it and being gentle with ourselves, not rushing that.
I love that. I love that permission right now that you've given everyone to take the time to process, and you don't have to know how you feel right when you get those results. Cassandra, I have loved having you on the podcast. I've loved this conversation. I like to end my chats with one question. My podcast is called Happiness in Progress, about finding more joy in the good, the bad, the in-between. What would be your number one tip to doing that? Finding more joy.
Finding more joy. Well, for me, it's travel, but COVID won't let me be great right now. So, one of the things that and that's probably why travel is one of my number one ways to find joy, is I just enjoy being outside with nature. Now, I don't like bugs and I don't like snakes, rodents, reptiles, none of those things. But it's something about just spending time outside, whether it's warm or cold, the sunshine kind of hitting you on the face. And so for me, that is what brings me happiness and joy, because it doesn't matter what's going on in your life. If you can just spend a couple of minutes outside, it really can boost your mood. So for me, it's spending time outside with nature.
Absolutely. I love that. When all the pandemic shut down everything, I was inside my house and I was nervous and I was scared. And then I exited and it just took all of that away. I could hear the leaves rustling in the wind and my kids laughing. And it was just like, brought me 100% into the present moment of like, this is what's happening now.
Yes. Cassandra, I totally did my back porch during COVID. So it's like my second office now. Mm-hmm. I never would have probably done that. First of all, I didn't have the time to do it. Mm-hmm. But so
it's a sanctuary. Really I think a lot of us have done that. Cassandra, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you loved listening to Cassandra. Of course, I will link all of her stuff in the show notes. She also does virtual therapy sessions, so you'll be able to find that if you're interested on her website as well. And I want to thank you for being here on Happiness in Progress.